So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who will give some opening remarks and then engage with a fascinating panel on issues of privacy. I have known our speaker, Michelle, for a lot of years. I'm not going to put a number on it, but considering how I look at this age, she must have been about 6 when I met her. But she started her adult life as a lawyer, and the disparaging things I said a little earlier about lawyers don't apply to her, because she's been fully immersed in technology for quite some time. I met her when she was at Sun Microsystems and engaged in some of the policy representation that Sun had. And I'll note we were really engaged with Sun for about the first 10 years of the center's existence, and might not be here had it not been for Sun's continued encouragement and support. After her stint at Sun, she went to Intel and was the chief privacy officer at Intel. And now she's the chief privacy officer at Cisco and a VP there. So she has been involved in setting policy and leading the industry in privacy in software, in hardware, and in networking. And I can't think of anybody better to lead off talk and panel than Michelle Dennedy. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. You know, it's never good to have staff introduce me, because now I feel like I should just sit down. Like, you know, you drop the mic and go. But thank you for that very kind introduction and all the years of friendship. Before we even begin, I was telling the guys that what I noticed was, as typical, all the guys with experience are sitting up here. I use experience for my gray hair. Students in the back, I want you to be bold. I want you to shake the hands of these men and women who've been fighting for the integrity and the safety of this planet for decades. You have no idea the kinds of experience that's sitting in this room. Please, please, I beseech you, when we're in the mixing times, when we're in the lunches, when we're in the hallways, walk up to somebody who's hanging out here and just tell them your name and ask them a story or two. You'll be astonished at really the amazing, amazing work. We have a lot of work to do, and we've heard a lot about that, and we'll talk about privacy, but I think it would be a disservice to you to not please beg you to take advantage of the mentorship and the capabilities in this room. It's really quite a remarkable thing. So I'm going to start off by kind of going down into the dark well of just crass greed. Sometimes we save the world because it's a good thing, and sometimes we do the right thing because it's human rights, and that's all great. But sometimes we can persuade and lean into business and speak the language of business and somehow get our imperatives across when it comes to data and privacy and governance. I wish I had written this article called The Privacy Revolt, a growing demand for privacy as a service. This is a service that will be a common service, hopefully within my lifetime, definitely within some of the folks in the back of the room. But privacy as a service, Scott McNeely, one of the founders and chairman of Sun Microsystems and my former boss, famously said, "You have zero privacy anyway," topped it off with a hearty, "Get over it." Now, as a young person at this firm, the worst bet, talk about gaming theory, the worst bet for this prisoner was to rush forward and say, "Hey, I'll do that job." Well, I did that job. And here we are 20 years later, privacy still matters. I look out at this room and I don't see a single person who is dressed identically, even our good folks in uniform. If there was another person, the way you wear your shirt's a little bit different, and I don't know if that's a demerit or not, you'll have to tell me later. But I've never seen a room, even in the Air Force Academy where I went and spoke, where everyone wants to be identical at all times. Privacy and the ability to tell a human story is a tremendously valuable thing to us as human beings, and it's tremendously valuable for us to use, exploit, protect. So So no matter what market you're in, no matter what service you provide, welcome. You're in the privacy business. For the privacy impact assessments that desperately try to say, I don't have any PII or personally identifiable information, so they can get out of privacy rules and protections, if you have customers, if you have employees, if you'd like to have customers or employees, you have a privacy issue. You're dealing with human beings and human stories, so welcome. Where you can get a little bit more information, because I'm just going to make a few remarks and then really turn it over to this incredible panel today. I've launched something called the Privacy Sigma Writers podcast to try to get, and we will be asking many of you in the room to come in on the show. It's a podcast, first of all, because I know that none of my sales guys like to read much. Who's in sales here? Yeah, they're not here. Right? And I sell, $3 billion worth of security kit. Our sales guys aren't here. They're in the airports, they're on the road, they're in their cars, they're at restaurants and golfing and do whatever. They listen to stuff. So by doing things in their ears, I'm able to reach them on a different level by talking to people who are diverse on a lot of different scales. My daughter, when she was 8, said, Mommy, why can't I be normal? I said, you're asking the wrong mommy. I've never been normal. But I drew a standard curve for her. And I said, some people call this the bell curve. And your ability to, I kid you not, that's her calling me right now. She's also got a little psychic thing. I said, people that brush their teeth a certain way or fold their clothes in a certain way, they all belong under the bell curve. The weirdos, freaks, the people who think outside the norm over here under 1, 2, 3 deviations from standard, those are the people that are my people. It's you people. Welcome, freaky people. So give a listen to the Privacy Sigma Writers and see what you think, and please send some feedback or volunteer to be on the show. We'd love to spread the word beyond the people that we can squeeze into this room. Even after 20 years, we don't have enough diversity of talent, of proclivity, of day-to-day work to get people as excited about this field as should be. So I wanted to look at what is the barrier to entry, if you will, of privacy engineering and privacy by design technologies. Because if it's a do-gooder mission, it's very hard for me to go to any of these large infrastructure companies where I've been spending a lot of my time and convince them this is something worthy of investment. Because there is this old native narrative that I think is false that says that people don't care about privacy. Young people don't care about privacy. Here's a young man. Do you care about privacy?
I should.
He does. Shh. Never ask a question when you don't know the answer. Yes, I do, says young Brett with his camera, which I know how to hack, so next time answer my questions correctly, Brett. Just kidding, a little bit. Young people do care about privacy, and why do I know this? I look at how they interact with their devices. They get off a platform if they feel like they've been cheated by that platform. If I go on my kid's device, I guarantee you, suddenly they've done all their homework, they're going to bed on time, they're exercising, it's so great. You go on Facebook, all my friends have a perfect life, I'm falling apart, but everything's great. People are curating their data online. People are deeply offended by what happened in the Cambridge Analytica case, and I think it's the beginning. I mean, today is the beginning. After all of these breaches, again and again and again, we're just weary of the no consequence, maybe $50 hit on the credit card, some inconvenience. Now we're faced with the real confrontation that it's not just an email that has been lost. It is potentially the ability to get the information that I asked for only and not be taken advantage of by somebody who wants to purchase that information to manipulate. This is the first time I think in the public dialogue we've talked about information being powerful because the data is the data itself. So what does this look like when we look at the IoT world? So there's an estimated $30 trillion of addressable market within the next 5 years. Trillion, with a T. A billion seconds ago, 30 years ago. A trillion seconds ago, 30,000 years ago. This isn't a little bit more money. This is a massive market. Privacy dependent applications, healthcare, information that is curated for the purpose of analytics or the data itself, represents about 16 trillion. So what we did, our methodology was going through each of these things and saying, what are the things that are non-SCADA systems, for example, non-machine to machine, something that implicates a human or a human story. And it's a little fuzzy. I realize I'm in a college, so little fuzzy methodology where a car is a thing, and a phone is a thing, and a sensor is a thing. These things are quantum difference things, but you get my drift. There's a lot of business here. So the other thing I did was having a lot of experience on the legal side. I was in sales for a little while. That was painful. Be nice to your sales guys. It's a hard job, particularly if you're a CISO. Who's CISOs in the room? Okay, you guys are mean. I tried to sell to you. Not him, but guys like him. They're mean to salespeople. They don't believe salespeople. You know why? Because we lie. Everything's working. Everything's pretty. Nothing to see here. But once you have a data system, now we don't lie, of course, like other people do, but not Cisco. We're good. We are actually good. What I was noticing across the years was the minute someone raised their hand and said security or privacy, either someone went like this and signed, or what data is in this? Does the sales guy even know what it is? You go, maybe you find a PM. What information? What are the APIs? How does it interoperate with that thing? God forbid, do you have a CPL? Do you have standard template forms? On and on and on and on. And what we realized that if you go through using a generally accepted privacy measurement, so we echoed the security 0 to 5 ad hoc to optimize system, if you get to even a level 3, of having written policies that most people know about with some objective standards and procedures, you can get an 80% improvement in the time to close a data-sensitive deal. Now remember our premise, if you've got customers and employees, you're going to have data-sensitive deals. You're going to have benefits that need to be bought, you're going to use cloud services, you're going to have communications, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The outlier in our study of 3,000 customers worldwide, double-blind study, so they didn't know it was us. I don't know who they are, but they were qualified by the research team in 20 different countries. 17 weeks at the outside to close a data-sensitive deal. Once we got to a privacy mature, and these are all, this is not ice cream causing summer. These are all self-attested levels of maturity. But they are attesting to 80% improvement in performance and maybe 3.4 weeks. Now, where in the SEC run world in the US, you're closing business every quarter, a 17-week to a 3.4 week saves your sales team, gets your development team back on track, gets your sales engineers back moving around as you want them to do. It helps business run better to have better privacy and security practices. And it's iterative. So these guys think they're coming to me to get their deal closed. They're taking training from me to protect their stuff. They think they're coming to me to get better terms and liability issues. They're starting to learn about what's a privacy engineered environment really look like. What are the data implications of connecting system A to system B? So all of these things, I think, have a very healthy, positive reaction. And I'm not going to go through the rest because I'm running out of time. But, you know, when one has a hammer, the world looks like a nail, right? So privacy engineering has been something I've been working on, since before Bill Malik joined Sun back in 2000-ish, when we put our identity portfolio together. Privacy engineering to me is the functional definition of privacy by design. Privacy by design is a policy. It's a great policy, aspirational, don't screw people. That's the, if I had more time, I'd give you all 7 principles, but don't screw people. That's privacy by design. The way a lot of firms, particularly SMBs, but even large companies are practicing privacy by design today, even though in the European theater, failing to do privacy by design can be a 4% global turnover mistake. Typically, John, Bill, Joe, and legal. are invited into a room. John, Bill, and Joe say, we're going to build this thing and it's got data stuff. And legal sits there and goes, oh, there's some issues here. 18 months goes by and they come back, legal, I need you to write a disclaimer. Privacy by design, yay! No, privacy engineering is really understanding that privacy at its core is the authorized processing of personally identifiable information according to fair, moral, legal, and sustainable principles and practices. You don't want so much privacy that you're not doing business. You don't want so little that you're not doing business. It all kind of fits together. And it takes a very data-centric view and understanding the value of data. So now that I've made my little pitch for privacy, we're going to bring on the big guns. This is going to be good. So privacy versus security. First, I'm going to go down the panel, and I'm going to let you guys introduce yourself, and then if you don't do a good enough job, I'm going to brag about y'all. So game on. We're going to start with Stephen Reynolds, the Iceman. First, we'll see how technical the legal people can be.
Here we go. Can you hear me okay? All right. I'm Stephen Reynolds. I think I recognize some people in the audience here. I'm based out of Indianapolis. I'm at Ice Miller. I am an attorney, but before that I was a software developer, so I come at this with a little bit of a tech background. I co-chair Ice Miller's data security and privacy practice, so looking forward to talking to everyone here.
Sam?
Yeah, my name is Sam Curry. I started life as a crypto analyst and cryptographer. Among other things, I ran RSA Labs for years, was CTO and CSO there. Also chief security architect at McAfee. I've been involved with CERIAS for years. I'm currently I'm currently the chief security officer for Cybereason in Boston.
And we'll brag about that a little bit. Go ahead, Chris.
Chris Clifton. I'm on the faculty here at Purdue University, computer science, statistics, and I've been involved with CERIAS for most, although not all, of the 20 years. My background is database and data mining. I want your data. I want to know all about it. I want to do all kinds of things with it. And early on, I realized that poses a problem. It poses a challenge. We need to worry about privacy. And so my work has primarily been, how do I analyze your data when I'm not allowed to look at it?
Amy, can you answer the question after you introduce yourself?
I'm Amy Hess. I'm the head of the FBI's office in Kentucky. Before that, I was the head of the FBI Science and Technology branch, but for about 20 years prior to that, I did nothing remotely related to technology, despite having an engineering degree from this university. So that just shows you how well the FBI can place people in technical positions. But obviously, going dark has been a hot topic for me in my prior positions prior to the time I assumed my current role.
So let's dive in. I mean, so we have data grabbers, data analysts, guys who tell you no, and the cops. So, Amy, I'll start with you. She's like a superhero. Let's talk a little bit about privacy and security as they've sort of evolved over the course of your career.
Sure. One of the things that I think always strikes me in these conversations is people tend to oversimplify this whole conversation. And it basically, people want to walk away with sound bites to say, well, law enforcement is against security. Law enforcement is against privacy. Law enforcement is against human rights. Or it becomes this versus thing instead of recognizing that the human rights advocates also are concerned about law enforcement, about whether or not we can do our jobs. The IT industry is concerned about whether or not we can do our jobs. The question is, how do we all have a conversation going the same direction? And so that is clearly a significant challenge for all of us as we try to grapple with this idea of, for me, in my business, I see this proliferation of technology taking the form of no longer do I dispatch agents out to do with a search warrant authorized by a judge, and they come back with a whole bunch of banker's boxes, and we fill up a warehouse of paper, and then we're spending a lot of time going through it all. Now it's all digital. And the question is, A, can we even access that information despite having a search warrant that's been signed by a judge? Secondly, is now it's actually a lot more than the banker's boxes we used to get. So how are we going to make sense of all of it? And how many people do I devote to that job? And are there time restrictions? Is there somebody, a life perhaps, or some other victim who is going to be impacted if I don't work quickly to get to the evidence? So those are essentially some of the challenges that we see.
So, Stephen, why won't you give Amy your data?
Well, funny you ask that. So in my practice right now, I'm actually dealing with a fairly significant data breach and working with the Indiana FBI. So I've been working back and forth on what data to give them. And it's one of those situations where, before any data leaves the client, outside counsel wants to look at it first when we're having these data breaches. So I know that sometimes can be a little bit of frustration. So we try to review these documents and get exchange logs or whatever data is being requested by the FBI as soon as possible. I think you have this tension. Some of it is company driven. So our client, when I'll use this current data breach as an example, or I should say security incident as an example. They said we want to work with law enforcement. We want the FBI to be involved, and we've got them involved. But then once there's requests for information and data, it's like, oh, I don't know. You start thinking, how much information is leaving the company? Could sensitive documents be leaving? So I think you will always have, this ongoing tension to some extent between privacy and security. One example I like to give is a lot of the security incidents and data breaches we see are caused by former employees. It's the person on their last day at work plugs in a thumb drive and takes some data with them, and then leaves to go to a competitor or start their own competing business. Well, we've been in meetings with, I'm legal, there's privacy officer, security officer, and after one of these events has happened, we're talking about what we can do to prevent it. And security officer is saying, I didn't realize this employee was having bad performance reviews and all these things. If I would get that information, I could do some increased monitoring on these employees. And then privacy officer is saying, I don't know about giving that HR information to the security person. And legal's dealing with what are the actual laws and regulations that apply here. So I think you're always going to have some tension, but I think having that conversation and having the right people in the room, actively discussing this is kind of the best way to resolve it. But I think you're always going to have some tension there.
So, Sam, there's
Yeah.
a lot of data. So Amy needs her data. She's got lives in the balance here. Stephen's trying to block her. Just kidding. He's got a cross-sectional group of people trying to figure out what the right data is. But we can only make decisions so quickly with this volume. How do we know? Where is the Cybereason here? What do we do?
I'm not entirely sure Cybereason is relevant at this point. Maybe
I'm
later.
trying to make this.
I appreciate
like
the
that?
effort, but maybe just.
You might want to start by telling them what it is, so that.
Yeah,
Because I did screw it up.
No, you didn't at all. I'll talk about Cybereason in a moment, but I think the first question, the security versus privacy, I actually think it's a false dilemma. I think the two are orthogonal to each other. There are classic definitions for both, confidentiality, integrity, availability. But I think one of the most pragmatic ways of defining security is probably the cost to break a system or to own it, right? In other words, you're going to use the mechanism for some other purpose than what it's intended. I think privacy is very different, and I would put in even person-centric up there rather than data-centric, because I think of privacy in at least a pragmatic way as the cost to obtain information about someone and their relationships to others. So if you could think of, in an object-oriented way, if you could think of a graph where the vertices represent people and interactions with objects that we care about, like systems, then essentially the edges, that those contexts, those relationships, it could be the cost to obtain those about any one node, right? And so just as we can see the cost to break something come down in security world, completely independently from that, we can see the cost to obtain information about someone and to be able to walk that graph with impunity for certain use cases can be harmed. And as soon as I think you start thinking about it like that, we could say, well, there are some ways to walk this graph that make sense. The FBI needs this information, and I don't think any of us would want to deny that in order to save lives and, quote, do the right thing. But we do want to prevent people from being able to abuse the system or be subject to cons or to be manipulated or to have our society break down because there are divisions being created, as we saw recently in the Facebook case, at least the alleged ones. There are situations that are created by erosions to privacy, making it easier to walk this graph for nefarious purposes. Totally separate from that, Cybereason helps to make it more expensive to break into companies and such. But privacy doesn't necessarily have a linkage with security, although they can influence each other. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Put some ideas out.
I think it's very helpful, and I think, Chris, I'm anxious to hear you're anonymizing the world, but you want more data at the same time. How does this dilemma play out in your part of the world?
Well, I think one of the first things security people have to realize is privacy is not just confidentiality.
Yay.
I mean, yes, a lot of what you see in the law, you know, if we're talking about compliance, often privacy is confidentiality. But if you're talking about retaining your customers, it's something much more. And Michelle, I think, really said it beautifully. You know, it's about having control over your story. And this is, once we start thinking of it this way, this is where we see, yes, there is a problem with security. Because if I really have the ability to project my own story, that what people, the view they get of me is what I want them to see, well, suppose I'm a nefarious actor. But the view that I project and what people see, what people understand, is what I choose to have them see, which is probably not going to be that I'm someone they should be coming to arrest. And I think this is really where we start getting this, this problem, is because what people really want in terms of privacy is something that can be misused just the way that people are getting and misusing data about people. And so I think there is a challenge that we face in terms of how do we let people have that control over how others perceive them, and yet limit that to things that are considered societally acceptable. And this gets to be very interesting when you start getting into different societies believing different things are acceptable. So that's a take on it. I think it's actually a much harder and deeper, and that there really is a versus in there somewhere.
Interesting. So we have a little grain of controversy here, which I like. Let's keep picking away at this a little bit. So how, and I'll open this up to all four of you. How do you then prioritize security versus, if you see a versus, or if you're building an orthogonal model, and how do you figure out what are the gives and the takes as you're presenting the case for privacy and security?
Maybe I'll jump on that just as a practitioner up here, because I spent the last 4 months in GDPR hell. That's actually one word, right? It's,
yes.
It's GDPR.
It's a bad word. It's a four-letter one.
For me, it has been a subset of security, but it is taking on a life of its own, and I'm actually pushing for it. We're about 350 employees, so we're not that big, but I'm actually pushing for people dedicated to privacy even now, and even perhaps having somebody and peeling it out from my responsibilities, not because I don't want it, but because I think it deserves to have an advocate that addresses it differently and thinks about its evolution independently. But it has fallen under my purview, and it is getting covered, at least under GDPR, it's getting covered as, are we doing the right, do we have the right frameworks, are we doing the right hygiene, and it's more of a, are you doing your homework type of thing. And I don't know if that helps to tee it off, because just that's how it's actually evolving with us, and certainly many of my customers and partners as well. Probably yours too.
I'm hearing you're actually hiring for a discrete privacy
Yeah,
person, which
yeah,
is a
that
pretty
wasn't
high
a job
prioritization.
offer, but if anybody's interested, they can.
Oh, come on. You see how he teased me on and then rejected me? This is my life with security, people. That's how it's
But
been.
but I am looking to staff it up, just because I believe it's going to have a life of its own. And Cybereason is also owned by a company. Our largest investor is a company called SoftBank, who have a lot of investments, and they see security as a big pillar. Personally, I like Chris's mention of control over your own story.
Yeah.
You know, I think one of the things that we want out of all of technology, we want to embrace the potential for what the human condition can be with IoTs and clouds and all the wonderful stuff we've seen in science fiction films, right? We want that life. And we've had FUD, I heard that term thrown out earlier quite rightly. We've had a lot of FUD over what can go wrong if you don't do the security correctly. But I don't think we want privacy in the way of it either, and to make it help, right? So that notion of control over your own story, I certainly resonated with me, Chris.
I think that's the one thing that I think is so often missed in security symposia is you cannot do this job and be a pessimist all the time. You have to have an outcome. And so I agree with you, the outcome of improving or optimizing the human condition wherever you are in that world is a really important outcome. Amy, you see sometimes folks who are not optimizing for the best of conditions. How does that play out for you when it's privacy and security in a less than optimal objective world?
Yeah, I obviously agree with the trying to control your own identity, trying to control your own story, unless, of course, I'm trying to figure out who you are and hold you accountable for the crime you committed. And obviously that's where the challenges that we see come into play. When we talk about security, when we talk about as I said earlier, it devolves into this oversimplified conversation. I remind myself of how many agents and how many personnel we have across the country, across the world, really, going out and talking about the importance of privacy, the importance of security, the importance of things that will protect the victim, so that they don't have their information stolen or otherwise misused. But yet it's that small percentage of people out there, those nefarious actors, that at the same time, it sort of pits us in law enforcement against ourselves. Because by the one time, we're advocating, protect yourself, get better at this, try to implement these systems. And by the same token, upon, again, getting a lawful order with a predicated investigation, I think that you are the person that I may be after, but I don't have enough evidence to prove it in court. I need to be able to collect that somehow, which means I've got to be able to somehow get to the data that I need. And so that, in my view, as I've kind of boiled it down in my head, kind of puts us at odds with ourselves sometimes.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm going to pitch you up, Stephen, again on the legal side. I've been very worried about a certain tree growing sometimes out of DC and sometimes at the state level, and the roots may become poisonous if we don't have integrity for if we are building digital cases and dossiers that are appropriately applied against the nefarious actors in our societies. What happens when we can't trust that evidentiary trail of data? Let's talk about the fruit of that poisonous tree, and is that an issue that you're seeing in your practice?
You know, it is when I see, I don't work in the criminal context, but these have applications in civil as well, I think. We have to worry, where the underlying data is coming from. And I think one of the things, I kind of see myself sometimes on both sides of these because I represent some internet service providers, and we get
I'm sort
those.
of turning him into a criminal lawyer. He actually is a commercial lawyer, but
so we'll get it.
Thank you for playing with me, all of you.
No, so we may get one of the court orders from a federal judge that the FBI has requested that says to our client they cannot disclose this to anyone, and me as an individual, as a citizen, that's kind of a shocking thing. In law school you learn these open courts we have. We have this secretive court order that literally the order says on it.
Oh, the Patriot Act.
Only share this with your legal counsel. But then on the other side, you have to trust kind of this faith in the system that I don't get any underlying basis. The client has no idea why we have this order that just has some minimal information, maybe an email address and some dates and times, and it's saying you have to provide us with all of these things. And the only person you can share this order with is your attorney, and you have to have some confidence level, in the system that before this order was issued, that the court had some good faith basis to get that data, because the data they get from us will be real data, but I don't really get to see those roots. I think you have to have some trust in the system and in our officials and judges that before this data grows into the tree that the roots of that data was solid and not poisonous. Because I think you just don't really have access to that right now in our system.
Yeah, and I think it points out, I think Josh said it earlier today, that having some technical prowess along with policy development is so critical, because it is, there isn't a discrete public and private partnership anymore. It really is data and humans. And I remember back in the day, see, I'm not a very good moderator, I gotta tell my little stories. Right after the Patriot Act was passed, private company asked by other private and sometimes government entities as well from other countries, will you agree in this legal agreement to not follow the Patriot Act if presented with a secret warrant? And I was like, no. This feels like actual treason now versus a maybe something might happen later. And by the way, I'm a private actor here. So it puts information into a really weird, nether, borderless kind of society. So I'm going to point at Chris. It really has nothing to do with what you do. But
No,
thoughts?
but I'll tell you, I'm champing at the bit because I just heard the easiest opportunity for a spear phishing attack.
Right?
You're
Right?
sending, how do you know who that order came from? How do you authenticate that thing? You're not allowed to talk to anybody about it?
I always think that's interesting about it. And quick aside, there is an example of someone actually getting out of prison by forging judges' signatures on orders, because who calls and calls the court and says, "Hey, did you issue this order?"
Yeah.
Not that I'm encouraging people to forge judges' orders, but
This is scary.
All the good cowboys walked in the light of day and just asked for a sack of money, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting thought that this, secrecy gives us such opportunities for people who want to do the wrong thing.
That's why we have really smart cops.
Yeah, but I mean, there was one we had a while back where people were getting, completely off the subject, but people getting stopped flying private aircraft by Customs and Border Patrol, or not Customs and Border Patrol, variant local enforcement at the request of somebody, and nobody seemed to know where these were coming from or who they were. And I always wanted to look at crime statistics and see if there were things happening across the county at the same time. And this was a chance to get local law enforcement away to some place where they were out of the way.
Note to law enforcement in the room, Chris Clifton.
It's like, so many of these things where there are secretive things going on just seem
I'm glad you're on our side.
like they open up all kinds of, that's one of the things about working in security is you have to learn to think like the adversary in order to defeat them. And, but yes, to get back to this, it is an interesting challenge, and from a privacy. But at the same point, if we don't have decent security of our information, how is it I tell my own story if someone else either goes in and gets that data and can put things out there I don't want to put out there, or can go in and change it? That all of a sudden the story I want told about myself is changed by somebody else to something completely different. We need that information security.
Absolutely.
And but then again, if we don't have privacy, do we need the information security? If the information is already out there, everybody has access, everybody can change things, what's the point in worrying about it anyway? I don't know.
I have answers. Do you guys does someone want to pick up on that thread?
Well, I don't think all information
It's
is
the nothing
privacy
to
information,
hide.
right? There's other
Right.
types of information as well.
Right.
But it strikes me that too much abstraction, right, to an inability to get to understand what's happening under the hood is always a dangerous thing, right? And that we require, it would seem just from the conversation so far, we require the ability to verify. It's not just confidentiality, integrity, availability, but veracity
Yes.
and transparency. I think I said just recently in the Facebook exchange around Mark Zuckerberg, I said publicly he has an opportunity to embrace radical openness, and he's not doing it at the moment. I also find it ironic that when they had this issue with Cambridge Analytica, that he didn't use social media to make a statement. That he took between, I think it was like 5 days, and then he put out a written statement, which is ironic in the extreme, right? There's an opportunity for leadership here. There's an opportunity to say, so here's how you put brakes on a car so it can go faster, right? As opposed to, let's do all this secretly and in a hidden way. And I think it behooves us to have a public debate about it as well.
Yeah, I like that a lot, because I've heard the nothing to hide argument for a long time, until you realize that, I was actually just talking to a young woman yesterday before I took off to come here, and she's being trolled, and someone got her divorce papers and put things in there that are not in the file documents. It looks real, it smells real. She's a corporate officer at her company right now, and she's having a very hard time, even with a court order, getting some of the search engines to take it down. And she can prove, most of it is not true, and would violate all sorts of laws, even in the US, where we only have a fractured approach to data protection. So I think there's a lot of mischief people can get up to. I'm going to switch tracks a little bit and say, who wants to wish on a star? The next round, it feels like a game show, doesn't it? I wish we had prizes.
How many points for this round?
Let's play Wish
Lightning
on a
round.
Star. Like, if there's one thing that you would change about privacy and security in the paradigm today, if you could wave your magic wand, what would it be?
I guess I'll jump in.
Sam's like appalled.
I have an answer. I have an answer that has nothing to do with privacy.
That's okay.
Maybe it does. Go ahead, Steve.
I would add to Sam, I know GDPR helped for you, but it's been great for us privacy.
Here you are. If you can't be part of the solution, you can make a lot of money consulting on the problem.
There's
As
that.
soon as they passed it, it was like, you get a lawyer, you get a lawyer, you get a lawyer.
Yeah, I think my privacy practice has just been expanding.
$6
this
billion
year.
in services this year.
But,
$6 billion.
I think the one thing I would change, I think that privacy, means so many different things to different people. One of the things, a large sector of our work we do is for hospitals. And, there's HIPAA, which, is just a bare minimum. That's a floor, not a ceiling, as, we like to tell our clients. But I think when we're coming up with policies in the hospital on, what types of information gets disclosed to family members, we try to look beyond, just what HIPAA allows and provides. And at least what I do internally at my firms, I like to just kind of roundtable things and I don't just talk to lawyers about it. I want to ask my assistant and the people who are in the mailroom, hey, what do you think if you went to a hospital and they did this? You came in and were unconscious and they did this act. What would you think about that? Would you be okay with that?
If that is remove all cellulite, my answer is yes.
So I think, always, and I think what's important here is just having that discussion. And I think part of that, making sure you're having that discussion about privacy and what it means in security, is making sure you have a diverse group of people involved. So if I'm only talking to lawyers about it, that's a problem. If I'm only talking to security people, that's a problem. If I'm only talking to privacy professionals, I think that's a problem too. And so I think you should talk to people of different backgrounds and experiences. I speak at a conference every year where I ask people what they think about their privacy and tracking data, and then I ask them how many are members of the hotel's reward system, and everyone raises their hand. So they're all so concerned about privacy, but they're just willingly giving information about their travel and where they're located to any number of third parties. So I think just having that discussion with people and getting a lot of different people from different backgrounds in the room, I think is really important. That would be the one thing I would change.
I love that, and I'll tell a little story about bad law. I had a neighbor, I was doing a lot of child ID theft training. People don't realize how vulnerable our kids are if they're not buying houses. The child's identity is clean. It's very, very valuable. And anywhere, we did a study back in, this is old news now, 2010, and at that point, 11 to 12% of American kids were being issued a Social Security number with what I call a financial birth defect, with already cards and criminal things on their credit report, including my own daughter, who had a terrible credit rating 11 years before her own birth. So I was out on the road and I was training, and this man came up to me and he said, I have a privacy thing, and I hate lawyers. I was like, okay, privacy I can help with, hatred of lawyers, probably not so much. And he said, I showed up at the hospital with my 6-year-old diabetic daughter, and they took our information, went in the back room. All of a sudden, the police came out, separated us. She's now in a diabetic situation. She's getting treatment, but she's with somebody from social services, and he's getting interrogated for blood work that includes all sorts of psychotropic drugs and alcohol, et cetera. Someone had stolen her insurance to get methadone and had all his clinics were attached to her file. And so, which is horrible enough, and it's deeply traumatic to the family and this poor little girl. Social Services was doing the right thing, right? They got the right information. They were trying to make sure that this child was not in danger. But here's where the bad lawyer comes in. Because of HIPAA, and I'll put it in air quotes because this is not because of HIPAA, because of bad lawyers' interpretation of HIPAA.
Happens a lot.
Yeah. He was told that although they cleared up the mistake, because of HIPAA, they can't take that blood work out of her records at age 6. They'll put a note on the file, and for the rest of her life, this will go down in her permanent record. No, we did clear that up.
Good.
But that's if lawyers only talk to lawyers and lawyers talk to bad lawyers, it compounds the interest of bad deeds. We already have Josh with a question. Should we start with questions, or do you guys want to finish waving your magic wand?
I'll wave a magic wand.
Okay, we'll wave the wand, and then we'll get to the
All right,
questions.
I got 3 wishes. They're fast. One,
Sure.
I really wish boards would care more about IT risk.
Yes, hire us. There's no CPOs on boards.
2, I really would like to see hardware roots of trust better leveraged.
sorry?
Hardware roots of trust better leveraged.
Yes.
There's good security at hardware, and nobody knows how to use it.
I like the old-fashioned roots of trust, baby.
And I would like an immediate ban on marketing departments using magic words, especially machine learning, artificial intelligence.
Artificial
big data.
intelligence is my favorite.
It should be prisonable offense.
I know. Artificial intelligence, I'm like, do we have regular intelligence nailed, people? 'Cause-
That one may be the hardest, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sadly,
it's
I
all
am.
about AI.
Yep, sadly
Well, my
I am.
favorite is the vendors coming to RSA like,
I have
"Hey,
bingo cards for
Michelle,
it, too."
Do you, I've got a solution for GDPR. Have you heard of it? I'm like, I know
They
I'm
can't
not
spell it,
stupid,
by
but
the way.
geez Louise, man.
They can't even spell GDPR.
They can't spell GRTP or something. Anyway, Chris and Amy, magic wands.
Okay, well, I have this vision of things getting to the point where data becomes so out of control and so uncontrolled that nobody believes anything anymore. You know, every photo could be photoshopped, and you know, our kids get brought up saying, well, you can't believe what you see or what you hear or what's in the data. Nothing can be believed. And what can we do about that? There's got to be something. My hope is that we get to a point where we can say, we don't really need all that data. You know, we need something, but we do this in a way where there's not the risk to privacy. That we get what we need without risking privacy. That we, instead of saying, hey, I need all this data and I don't know what for, I might need it someday, we figure out a way to keep what we need, use what we need, get the good results out of it, but not place people at risk.
Yeah. We have data obesity issues.
I think for me, the magic wand would be, I suppose, the ability to take away this polarization of the phrase secure third-party access, where we can't even start a conversation about it. And again, I know many people have different opinions about whether such a thing exists. It depends on your interpretation of secure third-party access. I didn't say 100% secure. The question is whether we can even have a conversation about the risks associated with it on all sides of that equation. And for many years, we just haven't even seemed to be able to have a conversation. And so the magic wand is to get that away and sit down and have a conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. All right, we've got a lineup.
I'll have to go quick. Spaff's behind me. All right.
No pressure. You should see what he's doing.
All right. I'm going to disclaim up front that the opposite of a profound truth is not a lie. It's another profound truth. So I want to not squander the octane of the 5 of you. I'm going to go very provocative here. We like to say in the cavalry that we love our privacy. We'd like to be alive to enjoy it. And I'm going to give you 2 concrete examples where I think privacy's won too much, and they've sucked all the oxygen out of the room. I'm not anti-privacy, not. There is not if you look at every plane crash or train crash, the first thing they do is they race to get the black box. We want tamper-evident, forensically sound evidence capture to learn from failure to preserve the trust of the public in these mass transit economy enablers. There's not a single car company with a tamper-evident forensically sound evidence capture for the integrity of the electronic systems in it, because they're all terrified of the privacy activists. Terrified.
They need more CPOs on their boards.
Yeah,
That's my
we
provocative
are at a
feedback.
stalemate. GM wants it, all the Japanese want it, the Germans want to pass a lot, I get it. We're all afraid that in some obscure universe, we might turn in system integrity data into a way to hurt the privacy of the passengers who are already dead. The second one is HIPAA related. On our task force for Congress, we said all the incentives right now are to have a corpse with their privacy intact. There's the right thing to do from a legal defensibility posture is to maintain the confidentiality of patient data, not the availability of patient care. And there's serious loss of life and diminished patient care and throughput due to over-rotation on this. So I'm not anti, but how does the octane of the 5EU make sure that we don't suck all the oxygen out? To have privacy wins, we aren't doing it at the cost of intelligent, more comprehensive solving for all variables versus one. And that's not rhetorical.
Yeah, we'll start with you guys. I definitely have thoughts on this one.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on, I guess, on the auto question. You know, Indiana is interesting because there's actually there's an Indiana Court of Appeals case where someone was in a car accident. I think they were alleged to have been speeding, and then this accident resulted in, I think, someone died from it. And the police were able to recover the Garmin from the car, and they used the Garmin information they got from Garmin to figure out what speed the driver was going at the time of the accident. And they did this all without a warrant. The Indiana Court of Appeals ruled that was a violation of privacy, and all of that was tossed for that reason. So I think car companies, and consumers have this privacy interest in that kind of data, and I think companies do have a legitimate concern about starting to collect that data. Amy probably knows better the third-party doctrine and all these different there's all these different rules on the criminal side and this data and what it means if data you're obtaining is automatically going to third parties, whether you're losing some of your privacy rights and constitutional rights in that data. So I don't have much of an answer for you other than to say there's probably legitimate reasons companies have those concerns. On the HIPAA side, I just have to agree with Michelle. I think a lot of this is just a result of bad lawyering. I think I hear so many people say things about HIPAA that are just incorrect, and they publish these things and write articles on it and are even known experts in the field, and they're just entirely wrong. Now we have, in my own firm, we hired a former OCR investigator. So all she did was enforce HIPAA, and we'll be somewhere and hear a chief privacy officer say something, and I'll look over to her and go, "Is that right?" And she goes, "No."
Right.
And so the agency that enforces it.
Penicillin allergy in the ambulance.
Yeah,
Oh dear God.
So I think on the HIPAA side, I think the problem is people have gone too far in the interpretation. I don't think it's the regulation as much that's flawed, but I think people, bad lawyering and bad interpretations of it, I think are really to blame there.
It's not a perfect law, but
No.
so many bad interpretations.
So much bad information.
And I wasn't just
GDPR is going to be the same way. It's going to be-
GDPR is already it cures cancer on one side and is a nuclear fallout on the other. More responses.
We tend to think too binary a way, Josh, I think, about security. These things are often a continuum, and the same is true of privacy, that it's shades of gray as opposed to black and white. And when I talked earlier about the cost to obtain information and about context and relationships, I think we should choose some use cases that we make it easier, and we then have some first principles to not make it worse for most of the rest. And that we then aggressively pursue that. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue about a black box in a car, but how over time that then gets accessed, and does it get connected to the internet, and then who can see it? And I know you're intimate with the 5-star stuff. I know you're intimately familiar with what they're going through. But it's going to take advocacy, and then once these capabilities exist, it's going to be really hard. And please forgive us if it sounds political. I don't mean it that way, but not to have a new law come out that makes it easier to get to that information for use cases that were explicitly prevented to begin with, right? So I think we're going to have a discussion about which pathways are essential for the public safety and public good and for improving and making things better. When accidents happen, you recall, you build a better car, right? Versus what marketing can access that, right? And it sounds like I hate marketers. They're actually quite useful, right? But what other uses are not going to be allowed for that same information? And it's not here, just do this, right?
We have a lot of questions. You guys want to
It's piling
keep
up
responding,
there, too.
and we have a young man. Gene, are you willing to cede to the young man in the back there? You better make it good, bud.
He's clearly My question is,
I'm just saying the students look like they're interested.
my question is, do you guys believe that law enforcement has appropriate access to people's data, or should their access level increase or decrease?
Can we answer that? Sure.
Everyone kind of went, whoop.
I actually wanted to address that in the context of the prior question as well. And what Stephen was referring to. So, not to go down the path too far of constitutional law, but many years ago we decided as this country that the people should be protected against unreasonable searches. Not all searches, but unreasonable ones. And so the challenge for us is the interpretation of that. If the law enforcement basically asks for data and the data is given to them and it wasn't properly predicated, that perhaps they received the data either through some misunderstanding or even through some type of deception, then absolutely that should not be allowed. Because we decided as a country that's unreasonable. And however, when we do reasonable searches, we do searches with a warrant that under American jurisprudence, we've actually convinced a judge, an arbiter, that we have probable cause to believe that there is evidence of a crime in a particular place. Even if we're wrong, then obviously that's our burden to be able to prove that, to be able to then effectuate that warrant. The challenge comes in then when we serve the warrant and there's nothing there, or we can't obtain the information. If the black boxes are so basically nailed shut that we can't get in the information even despite that level of proof, that's where the challenge comes in. So do we have enough authorities? Personally, I think the authorities are fine. The question is whether or not we have the ability to execute on those orders.
Yeah, I'd like to do a study on a time to close on warranting, getting that data, just as we're doing on closing commercial transactions. I bet that there's a lot of efficiency and improvement in, do we have judges that have an understanding of what is reasonable in an electronic context? Should we be automating and caching information, putting it in escrow until people can sort these things out? I think there's a lot of innovation in that field as well. So that's a really provocative thought. Dr. Spaff.
So a quick observation and then a question. So the observation is privacy, like security, has no objective measure. It is relative to individuals, to societies, to time. In fact, there are multiple different kinds of privacy: transactional privacy, location privacy, health privacy, financial privacy, and so on. And so some of the discussion that we have now is related to the fact it's difficult to define and it changes. So that's just as an observation. If you want to talk about that, fine. But the main point I wanted to bring up was one where, Stephen, you mentioned trust. Amy, you were talking about execution of the law. Many people are worried about privacy in contexts of marketers, law enforcement, and others because they don't see how the information is being used. They don't know when it's collected. Secret warrants, effectively Patriot Act letters, and others don't see the light of day. And so Stephen Brin argued in Transparent Society, if anybody's read that, that one of the things that would do away with our fear of privacy violation would be if you could see what people seeing your data were doing with it. And so I wanted to put that forward as something that you may want to react against, is perhaps the privacy of what we do to violate privacy actually the bigger problem than the privacy itself.
The secrecy of how we exploit it, you mean? Yeah. Of course, in one of Brin's books, he also had a privacy Third World War. But yeah.
I think there's a point here that, and in fact, a lot of the way we do things today is based along this notice and consent idea, which in practice is completely meaningless because the notice is unreadable and the consent is basically you have no choice. It's notice and consent maybe, but it's not notice and choice. And I think that is a big part of the problem, is people don't know what's being done with the data. But when the data is collected, often the people collecting it don't know what they're going to do with it. And so this gets us to a whole new problem. And how do we go back and say, oh, try do the following with your data. I really didn't say I was going to do that before, but now I think it's a good idea. But oh, by the way, what I want to do, I consider to be my intellectual property. I don't want to talk about it with anybody. Yeah, it's a real quandary.
Yeah,
And,
I think GDPR has ideas about that, but not clarity. But I think your point about the over-rotation on the point of collection and ignoring the life cycle of data is a massive, massive issue. We have to govern it from cradle to grave, and sometimes the purpose will change, and then there has to be a reason. Either there's a societal reason, something's gone wrong, there's a purpose-driven reason that I can participate in some way, and I think that's where, when we were putting together the methodology for privacy engineering, really looking at universal modeling language and coming up with use cases and then following them through. We have a lot of work to do in this data and information society that we haven't even thought about, and we're trying to kind of put a notion of informed consent in front of all this other new stuff that we'll get there when we get there. And I see a lot of opportunity for innovation there. I wouldn't say it's a problem. It's an opportunity for innovation. Sir?
Let me preface this is a respectful question. I have great friends in the FBI. I have family in law enforcement and the legal system. The question is this term of trust. It started yesterday in the pre-conference, and you even said trust in the system. Okay, I'm a child who grew up in the 60s. I do not trust in the system. I trust you. I trust you. I trust Rocky and the FBI. I trust people I know, but I don't trust the system. And I think I don't do it with some just reason, as Spaff pointed out, for transparency. So I guess my challenge, respectfully, is maybe to the right and left wings of the panel. The FBI and Ice Miller, you guys got big cred. Okay, you have serious resources. What are you doing about this? Okay, how do I, put it locally in Indiana, but how do I, as a local citizen of Indiana, build back that trust in the system? Because I, to be perfectly blunt, I don't have it. I have trust in people, but I don't have trust in the system. So what are you going to do?
More magic wands.
No magic wands allowed.
Go ahead, you can start, I'll jump in.
Okay.
Okay. I'll go first. One thing I wanted to address from previously too is the secrecy of the warrants we were talking about. So, again, not to go down this path too far, but national security versus law enforcement investigations. And of course, with law enforcement investigations, clearly that's a much more transparent system because we've got to be able to prove this in open court in front of people. The challenge for us there technologically is to not reveal how exactly we went about doing something so that then the whole rest of the world, including all those other bad guys out there, get to see how exactly we did something, and now it's no good to us. And so therefore we go through a lot of deliberative process to try to keep things out of that public view that basically might otherwise be disclosed so that we can preserve that capability, at least as long as possible. In the national security realm, of course, you don't hear so much of this argument about we need more access, we need, the going dark argument as much. Part of the reason for that is because of the resources that national security organizations tend to be able to have, supercomputing resources, things that your local police department would never in a million years have access to something like that. But that's why, in addition to that, of course, most of their work is international, overseas. It may not, U.S. law may or may not have as much influence over the actions as it does in U.S. law enforcement domestic type of investigations. I'm not saying that, again, that this total secrecy, therefore, is justified. I'm saying that that's why you see a lot more being obviously protected under classification of national security investigations. The question about trust then comes into the deliberative process when it comes to policies, when it comes to legislation, when it comes to the open discussions that are held on this particular topic, on this particular debate, on these issues that we're here to discuss today, to engage in those conversations. There's lots of things. As a matter of fact, just this past week, I think there was like 3 different things on C-SPAN that dealt with privacy and security issues. And how do we make sure that everybody around the table is heard in that perspective? What comes out the other end could take years, and by that time you've forgotten that was perhaps an issue. But I think that transparency needs to be built into that process of how we're debating these exact things that we're talking about here.
I guess I could spend a lot of time on this question, but I will say in response, I think there are groups of people in this country, in particular, historically been marginalized and have good reason not to trust government and not to trust law enforcement. I don't know that there's a quick fix to that. I think part of what is helpful is things like Amy coming here. I think, the FBI speaking, coming to panels saying, here's what we do. I think that transparency, maybe sunshine is the best disinfectant. It's one of those situations where, having open discussions, understanding, what is the system? What are these warrants? What is the actual process like? What does the judge look at? Is the judge really looking at it, or is it just some law clerk? How does that process work? I think when people have more of an understanding of the system, they will have, you can build that trust. But I think it will be tough to do. This could be a generational thing, and I think there could be very good reasons why people don't trust these institutions.
Ready?
Yep.
So 2 things. One, it's about the expectation of privacy. Once you take away the expectation of privacy, then you get to do an awful lot of things. So corporates don't have U.S. government. Inside the U.S. government, there's no expectation of privacy, so you get a lot of surveillance latitude. Could you specify where privacy won't be expected in these infrastructures? Which would give security kind of an environment to work in so they can do the stuff that isn't really attempting to impact privacy, but they don't have to worry about the privacy protection so much? See, it's interesting when you flip it, right? So privacy is so important, but where can we guarantee that there is no?
So are you suggesting, for instance, somebody could launch a cloud service and say right up front there is no privacy?
Well, I mean, in the voice network, there's an expectation of privacy, right? In the data network, is there an expectation of privacy? Yeah. It never was designed for that.
Is different from if there is.
Well, it was never designed for that, and end-to-end encryption was a solution. So if you were concerned about privacy in the internet back in the late 90s, there wasn't anybody that was going to stop you from sniffing the wire. In fact, the government was doing it just like all the other ISPs were doing it, just to do operational management so they can know that things were working, right?
So but the capability often gets muddled, I think, with the legality and the desirability, right? So this is what I call a Lady Gaga problem. Lady Gaga shows up at the VMAs in a meat bikini. She's got the legs for it, but really, ew.
Well, one of the things we're finding right now, if you take Netflix out of the traffic mix on the core of the internet, the majority of the traffic is machine-to-machine communication. Has nothing to do with human anything. So the question is, does the core of the network have a pass on certain kinds of surveillance because they're really looking for rootkit break-ins, which are all control plane screw-ups. They're looking for botnets and all that kind of stuff, which are not human.
On you. So I think about networks a lot these days, as you can imagine. We have 80% of the world's traffic going on one of our networks at any given time, and that number's probably low. There's a lot of machine-to-machine stuff. We do all sorts of networking of SCADA systems and things where it doesn't feel like it's not an opinion type of personal data. But I think a couple of things, just to be very clear, again, to the definition is important when you're building the architecture. We're not talking about secrecy. So machine-to-machine, transparent operation and conversation of that architecture is not something that we're talking about as privacy. Privacy is the authorized processing of personally identifiable information according to these principles. So
it's just the entity that allows you to think that there might be not an expectation of privacy in this part of the network, but there is in this part of the network.
If you have a network that has no implications for any human being, any employee, any customer, or anyone who will have any impact, yes. I've never seen a network
There's
like
never
that
been
in
a
the last
network
30
that
years.
isn't a hybrid of either one. So it's really interesting, I think. And then the other thing is that we have 85, 90 years of
POTS, plain old telephone service, surveillance, wiretapping experience, and the legal system understands it pretty well. And we have two systems, one for content and dialing, and then we have CDRs. Our CDRs, which have very limited protection in the United States, I can go get my wife's cell phone call detail records if I have a good reason for it. Do we want to engineer into the internet that type of accountability because we know how to deal with it legally and introduce that as a potential solution for avoiding some of the other privacy problems, like content privacy? So I'm really mostly interested in how do we take the historical communications evolution and apply it to this new experiment, the internet, and get the same level of utility that society enjoys. And nobody has talked about trying to inject accountability into the system where it doesn't impact this content privacy. So just like NetFlow.
Yeah, so the accountability, and then I'll give our panel a crack at this one. The accountability is built into a well-engineered, privacy-engineered, data-centric, person-centric engineering platform. So yes, so who's the best security architect of all time? Gene Stafford. Good answer. Good answer. No, Jane Mansfield. Lift and separate, my friends. Lift and separate. So if you have a data pool that you know and you know what's supposed to be and you know how it interacts with other things, sure, put it in a container. And I don't mean, don't geek out on the current containers, philosophically speaking. So what you're talking about is being able to segment information that may or may not be directive, whether it's IP, secrecy, law enforcement data that has utility from other types of data. What you're talking about is a data-centric architecture. That doesn't mean you're trying to hide away or come up with an artificial barrier where privacy does or doesn't matter. Because the minute privacy doesn't matter, you've bumped right back into intellectual property again. And so why? What you're suggesting is a very heavy architecture that probably doesn't have the utility. But that's not being a moderator.
Well, I wonder if we'd had it. So to reinforce that, I wonder if we'd had it 30, 40 years ago, if the internet would have evolved at all, or as it has.
I think we had social
I don't
constructs.
actually know.
Remember flaming? Like, we always had privacy online. We just had a limited amount of people who all understood the culture. They were all kind of on the same page. And the universities could shut that stuff down, and did, when things got out of control. And then I think the cat kind of got out of the bag and we grew. But I agree, Sam. I don't think we ever really had this free and clear. And I think the other thing that's happening is you have to understand how isolated the US is on data protection and privacy. The PRC has stronger rules on privacy, and they've got 3,000 years of collectivism and no word for the word privacy. The European Union has spoken. They are going to go after finding authority for companies that don't do this correct, and basically just have to kind of like say croissant and you have jurisdiction. Slight exaggeration only.
1 second. I'm going to take these last two questions.
Yeah, we have 2
While
minutes.
these two questions are going on, students who are part of the poster preview, please come line up from this side. We'll get you in order. We'll try to get back on target a little bit on timing.
This is so cute. They're lining up. I love it.
So hopefully this is a quick one. Do you think, given the recent exponential explosion in data available, as well as the backlashes with data events in news recently, that users perceived a change in the social contract? And if so, what tools, actions, and methods can they do to enforce that with the system?
Small question.
Personally, I don't think so. I think they got a hiccup. That's just my personal opinion. I think this too shall pass. They're becoming more inured to it. I think it's raised the debate, and that debate hasn't turned into a substantial change. And sadly, I think there's some big brands counting on it quietly going away. But I think the next few months will tell.
I think some of this, we talk about expectations, the question on expectations. I think part of it, we don't even know what's happening. You look at the data ecosystem in advertising, and there's nobody who knows really what's happening with the data.
Even the advertisers.
No, yeah, exactly. The advertisers don't know where the data is coming from. There's so much going on. The way data is being collected. You say, well, I'm giving this app certain permissions and this app certain permission. Oh yeah, but they share a common ad library, which really ends up with the sum of those permissions in practice. And I don't know how many of you saw Mitch Daniels' op-ed piece. Our university president wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post talking about some things that we're doing here at the university where we're putting together data that any individual piece of this in isolation, people say, well, of course. But you put it all together and it's telling you things and being used in ways that it's a very slippery slope. And we don't know where we are on that. And what's the expectation when nobody knows what might be the next thing that happens?
And by the way, it doesn't take very much data to create PII. You don't have to
Not at
steal
all.
it. You can infer it.
And this is kind of where I push back because I hear this all the time, right? Like, we're just the pipes, we're just the chip, we're just the database, we're just and it's like all these just thes is a lot of information. So if you spend your time structuring and understanding the data asset, what it's worth financially, what it's worth socially, what it's worth as a human right or a piece of efficacy in the system, I think you build a better system than just trying to jump through loopholes that probably are going to end up around your neck.
This is for Amy and Stephen. Two-part question. In settings like this, we have time. You have time to consider, pro, cons, the discussions. When you have first responders, ATF, FBI, police responding to an active incident, clear threat to society, is there a difference expectation for privacy? And the second part is, what do you think about Apple's position in not assisting law enforcement for those active threat environments?
It'll take me like 3 hours to talk about the second one, so I'll go with the first one. Yeah, obviously the timeliness is a significant factor for us, and I do want to say that one of the things that we're challenged by is in law enforcement is coming up with good examples, because this is the reason why, is because I don't know an agent or an officer or a public safety officer, first responder, who takes no for an answer. Is that their mission is to try to save lives. The mission is to try to prevent the crime, or at least hold the person who did it accountable. And so they try to find workarounds as best as possible. Now, sometimes they're successful and sometimes not. What's lost in that storytelling is how much longer it took to get to the answer. And at the same time, we're seeing that more and more so, the percentage of the impact in our investigations is growing. Where we're unable to get to the information we need, more so and more so each year. And so right now it's about, for example, our director testified recently, it's about half of the mobile devices that are submitted to our forensic examiners we're unable to get into last year. 2 years ago it was only 42%. Before that, obviously, and we see that growing. The challenge for us is the reason you don't hear well, yeah, but you got it, didn't you? You ended up holding the person accountable. And that's a valid point. Now, it may not be the answer a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, because in the meantime, what's lost in the discussion is how long it took us to get to the answer. And that's where the public safety issue comes in, as to the timeliness of the solutions. And so to that point, does it mean that we alter the law? My opinion is no, you don't alter the law. The question is, how do we execute on the existing authorities that we have if we're unable to do so? I'll leave the Apple question to Stephen.
Well, amazing. I agree with pretty much everything Amy said. I think we may disagree a little bit on the Apple question, but I'll just briefly address, I think adding to what she said, I think the laws should not change for those circumstances. The way our courts work in the U.S., as Michelle mentioned, is when evidence is, and Amy mentioned this too, when evidence is obtained fraudulently or through deception, we've decided as a country that gets tossed out. We let someone who is guilty of whatever crime walk free because we think it's that important that we still follow the laws even in those situations. So I don't think the laws, I think I agree with Amy, I don't think the laws should change based on an emergency or things like that. On the Apple one, with the disclaimer that circumstances could change, I reserve the right to change based on exceptions. But generally, I take the legal position that companies should not be obligated to create things in response to a subpoena, and I take that position with documents as well. So if the FBI, or it wouldn't be the FBI, but the Assistant U.S. Attorney, or the DOJ or the SEC, whatever government agency subpoenas a client of mine, and they're asking for documents or things that we have in our possession, subject to other objections, we may have to turn those over. What I think law enforcement and government cannot do is require us to create something and then give to them. And I think that's the higher level position of Apple, that if we don't have a technology to unlock these phones, then we don't have to create one in response to a subpoena. There may be some other government mechanism that agencies can take to have that happen, but I think in response to a criminal or civil subpoena, I think companies generally should not be forced to create something, whether that be a document or anything else. So that's my general legal position on it, but I reserve the right to change that with additional information.
So with that, I see we've got a whole lineup of exciting new things. I want to mention one more thing. This panel is diverse in all sorts of different ways, mostly in viewpoint, and I think these are the kinds of conversations that help us make those trade-offs that we need to make. Is it privacy? Is it security? Is it and? What are our national interests? What do those mean when you're doing business in 165 countries? And so I will leave you with the other plea that I've been kind of leaving everyone with. Staff and I are both very devoted to diversity. Everyone in this room comes from a gendered, religious, ethnic background. If every single person in this room sponsors, not mentors, sponsors a person who is diverse from them, within this generation, we will see more black people on boards. We will see more women on boards. We will see more men and women in cybersecurity. We are 1.3 million people projected down. We need every one of you to stay loving cyber. I'm going to hire y'all. If every single one of us just does our bit with one person that we sponsor throughout their career and treat it like it's our own, this will be very different by the time my kids are up here standing at the podium. So with that, thank you, our panel, amazing. Thank you guys.